Zoe Garbett, you are in the London Assembly representing the Green Party and have been since May 2024. I want to thank you so much, giving your time for Turn Left. And we're going to talk about drugs today, aren't we?
Great.
I want to first start off. It's Anyone's Child. It's a campaign by the Transform Drug Policy Foundation. You've worked with them. Can you elaborate more on this for our audience who might not know?
Yeah, it's a really important place to start. So Anyone's Child is family, friends, and a group of people who have been most affected by the UK's drug laws. So most impacted by the fact that their family members and friends have died. And they are a group of people who campaign for drug reform because they think that our drug laws are the reason that their family and friends have died, and they want to see regulated and legal supply because they think that the way that drugs are available makes them incredibly harmful. And I think their voices are really, really important. They have an annual rally on Parliament in June where they go and speak to their MPs, and it's a really kind of visible, they set down a very visible stand of everyone that they know that's been affected by drugs and has lost their lives due to the fact that they're not able to access them in a safe and kind of supportive way.
So do you think that the conversation around drugs is still far too much based on criminality and not on essentially a health issue?
Absolutely.
Is that what this campaign's trying to do? And obviously the wider campaign?
Yeah, so Transform is a big organisation. They support Anyone's Child who's led by families who call out the war on drugs as being a huge failure, call it out for being a war on people and having disastrous impacts. Like we've had a prohibition approach to drugs and a very an illegal market that is allowed to kind of expand in an incredibly dangerous way for over kind of 50, 60 years. And if we look at any measure where you'd measure success of a policy, more people are dying from drugs. In London, 500 people died in 2023, increasing by like 10% each year since 2012, or, lower percentages, but increasing every year since 2012. More children are being exploited by the trade than ever. Last count was 50,000, but that was a few years ago, and the figure has been taken off the national website, so we don't actually know the number of children who are being exploited. The supply has become even more toxic, so that's why we're seeing an increase in death. Cocaine, for example, deaths went up by 30% in 2023 from 2022. That's nationwide. Because of the way that the laws have changed the way that the supply is operating, it's become more dangerous. And the stigma, like lots of the families in Anyone's Child that I've spoken to, some of them talk about the fact that their children died from drug use, and they think that people didn't phone for an ambulance because they were too scared of what might happen. They don't know if that was the case, but they feel that the stigma around drug use also compounds with those other elements and makes it incredibly dangerous. I think it's a health issue and a health crisis that is only being approached from a criminal perspective.
I mean, you touched upon essentially the illegal black market. We're going to get onto that in a second. But I think that, attitudes towards drugs, decriminalisation, legalisation, I think people's minds are changing. I mean, polling has showed that people warming to the idea that possession of soft drugs should be legalised. Now, of course, there is a big disparity between age, but it's kind of obvious, isn't it? I mean, so many social issues, there is a disparity between age, but I do think that people are warming to it. My question, though, is, having conversations with officers and officials, I mean, do they know that the current war on drugs is failing, or are they just incredibly stubborn and like, oh, we're just going to clamp down on our existing policy and hope it will work eventually?
I think that's really interesting. So the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights has said that the war on drugs has failed and we need a health-based, evidence-based approach to drugs. So I do think there is that's a really incredibly important voice, I think, for anyone who says they're on the side of human rights. They know that they need to be calling out the war on drugs. The UK has become an absolute outsider on things like cannabis. We've got countries, Luxembourg, Malta, Netherlands, Germany, and many more, regulating and legalising the access to cannabis, which puts us at a complete outlier. I'm hopeful that we will start having those conversations in the UK. But I think, public health professionals talk about taking a treatment-based approach. The Carol Black really important report from 2021 said that, it showed that not only did the criminal market and have all the costs of the way that we approach drugs cost billions, almost 20 billion, and talked about, needing to take a health-focused approach and invest in treatment. And lots of people can get on board with that. People want to see people getting the help for, their drug use. But I go one step further and say that we need to look at the root causes and look at how people access those drugs and the causes of people using drugs, and then look at how people could access that through health professionals.
Now, I watched your questions with the Met Commissioner. It was back in November. Interesting one, wasn't it? Of course, the big argument for drug reform, and I said I'd touch upon this, is that essentially legalisation effectively abolishes the black market, right? And I don't know, I think his responses were quite disparaging. It felt like he didn't take it seriously. And his only answer was, well, does that mean I'm going to buy crack on the shelves of Boots? And I think his answer was essentially, let's do the same thing as we've always done. It's crackdowns, but no analysis of the root causes, or even a different way of thinking when it comes to drugs. Do you think that's the biggest hurdle then? Getting those in authority or those in power to maybe not even completely agree with you, but to have an open mind on dealing with this global social issue?
I think you've touched on lots of really important things. So to start with the framing around how you'd access drugs, lots of people here legally regulate and they think that everything is just going to be on a shop shelf and you're just going to be able to go into a shop and buy heroin. That's not what anyone in the reform world thinks. We think that you can do that in a city anyway. If anyone wants to access drugs, there's loads of short clips of people trying to access drugs in a city and being able to just get hold of them within kind of 20 minutes of arriving. So drugs are incredibly accessible. I think people like to pretend that because they're illegal, they're not accessible. And a regulated, legalised market, and the way the Green Party talks about our policy, is you look at kind of licensed sales, licensed venues, pharmacy access, then up to prescription for the most dangerous drugs, and you look at that by harm. And that's why the Met Commissioner's flippant question of could I buy crack cocaine at Boots? Part of the answer is you could buy some drugs at Boots, but it will be from a health professional. You'll be getting that health advice. You'll know what's in it. Like, I try and use the example of if you went to a pub and someone poured you a pint, it'd be like guessing whether that's going to be 5% or 50% or maybe 90%. That's how people are accessing heroin in an illegal market. They're taking that risk. That's the introduction of synthetic opioids makes it incredibly more potent. And I think the current approach we've got has failed and is dangerous. But yeah, I think also the Met Commissioner, I was really challenging kind of the measures of the drug policing approach. Like I said, if you're seeing more death and you're seeing more criminalisation, you're seeing more violence, looking at how you could take, like if you took the whole market out of the hands of criminals, it completely takes out that drive, that profit. The Met Commissioner's point was that there would still be a two-tiered market. And, even in Canada, where they've legalised cannabis, 70% access it from a legal route. But you do have, a small proportion of people still accessing it in a different way. And that might happen. But I'm much rather 70 or 80% of the market was, legally regulated than what we've got currently.
Yeah, because his pushback was, well, if you legalise it, it's going to be more expensive because it's taxed and regulated. There are going to be people who are going to still go to the black market because it's cheaper. I don't think that's the way generally people work. No. And your analogy of pulling a pint is fantastic, because I think a lot of people who campaign on drug reform compare it to the prohibition of alcohol. Now, did the prohibition of alcohol stop people drinking alcohol? No, people were drinking bath salts. It was really dangerous. People were dying. Yeah. And now we've regulated it in a safe area, in a pub or at home. The quality of alcohol, if you want to say alcohol's quality, the quality of it is obviously better, it's healthier for you, or it's not as potent. And we've also created an industry out of it as well, let's say. Why can't people see the same thing? Why can't people apply the same logic of alcohol than with drugs?
Absolutely, and I think that's the culture around drinking. And obviously some people use the flip side and they sometimes throw alcohol at me as we've done this terribly, like lots of people are dying from alcohol use. And I do think that's an interesting one, but I think that's the way it has been regulated. You do have a huge profit, kind of the alcohol companies making a huge amount of profit who control a lot of how it's accessed, the culture around it. And I think that's a huge conversation we need to have. And a lot of our policy is linked to access to treatment, destigmatizing people getting help, education around use. And I think the story I heard recently, which I think is incredibly interesting, just speaking to your point of we've offered this with other drugs or in other areas. So there was a drug that was not accessible in a legal route about 10 years ago, that it was identified that people were accessing it from kind of pleasure perspective and were accessing it on an illegal market. They didn't know what the health advice was. It was potent. It'd been kind of, manufactured. It might be dangerous. And then there was this big conversation about how do we make this safer? And there was a sensible conversation about it, and they brought it into pharmacies, and people can now buy it over the counter because they were concerned about people accessing this drug from an illegal space. That was Viagra. So we took that approach with Viagra back in 2017, 2016. It was okay to say people are accessing this drug in a dangerous way. Let's bring it into the pharmacy so they can get some health advice. They can use the right dosage. They know what they're taking. What we're seeing now, ketamine, huge increase, especially around young people's use. We're seeing that impacts on their bladders and real bad health issues. And that's for a lot of ketamine use. And that's worrying. And the governments have recognised that. They've recognised this health crisis. But their only response is to reclassify ketamine as a Class A as part of this review, not to preempt it. But that seems to be the only possible outcome. And I just think that's really sad that you've got a situation where you could be taking a completely different approach and offering that same kindness as we've done before and saying, actually, we need to take this into a pharmacy. We need to make sure that it's a regulated, safe supply and that people are accessing it in a way that they can speak to people if they don't know what they're taking or they need that health support. And you can check people's age. Like a drug dealer doesn't check people's IDs. Like it's not the way people access drugs.
Drug reform, the way we're approaching it, the way campaigners are approaching it, the way you're approaching it, I don't think it's particularly radical. A radical way of thinking about this is, why is taking drugs bad? Now, of course, there are certain drugs that are incredibly harmful, and we are going to speak about the harmfulness of drugs. But I think this idea that we need to disparage everyone from doing drugs, it's really, really bad. But if you have drugs that aren't extremely harmful in a safe area, like Amsterdam, it feels like there's this kind of attitude towards drugs, that the idea that people just taking drugs is bad. Because some of the arguments against drug reform is, and what the Met Commissioner said, is that, well, if you legalise something, you kind of give a licence to people to say, oh, it's okay to do this. Is that such a bad thing to say to people, okay, what you put in your own body, if you do it in a regulated, safe area, is that even bad? It feels like there's a social attitude as well against this.
Absolutely. Humans have always taken drugs. It's part of our culture. It's who we are as humans. And also the language has always really interested me, that we've talked a bit about alcohol. Mm-hmm. Alcohol's not seen as a drug. So we like to refer to it as a drug.
Isn't it technically classed as a poison, I think,
also,
as well?
Even worse.
Yeah.
But we like to say kind of alcohol and other drug treatment to just really, describe it as a drug. And all the language around alcohol is different. You don't get high, you drink it, all the kind of language around it's really different. And therefore that breeds this difference between alcohol and other drugs. I think having drugs in a legally regulated space where people can talk about it, we're much more open about it, there's less stigma. I think seeing legalization and regulation as radical is really, those terms are very conflicting to me. I think people also often think that I come from a place of wanting more people to take drugs. And if anything, it's, our policy balances choice with keeping people safe, which is what you'd like a government to do. And I want people to be able, we've got age restrictions, like people over the age of 18, and kind of putting those drugs based on their harm in those different kind of ways of accessing it makes it safer. And I think having it in that structure, I want people to be able to use drugs in the safest way possible, and I want to reduce drug deaths. Like, that is my main motivator. And I think a lot of the time people think that you are blind to kind of the harms, whereas I think we're more cognizant of the harms and more accepting of them, and got that kind of health approach.
Which is, in a way, you could accuse those who want to keep the same policy as being ideologically driven, because the numbers speak for themselves. Whatever your views on drug reform, I think the current model is not working. Right, the war on drugs isn't working. Absolutely. So then to say, well, we care about kids and we care about people not taking drugs, and that's why we want to be strict on it. But the numbers don't speak for that. Whereas drug reform, there have been many examples where it's worked. So that side is ideologically driven. Have you had interesting discussions with police officers and politicians who actually agree that a different approach is needed, but they've just, haven't kept quiet about it, I guess?
So that's a great question too. So I've had conversations with frontline neighbourhood officers who are really concerned about seeing drug death and wanting to carry kind of naloxone, which is a really incredible antidote for reversing the impacts of an opioid overdose. So that's people using heroin, which obviously we're concerned about the changing market. So I've had conversations with people who are really, on the street and can see the impact of drug use, who want to see a different approach. I think there's a really interesting group of ex-police officers and other professionals called LEAP. And they are a group of ex-police officers who are speaking out about how the war on drugs has completely failed. So someone who I speak to a lot is Neil Woods. He was an undercover police officer for about 10 years, a few years ago, mainly up north, and just talks about how he went into it thinking that criminalising drug use and going after the top bosses was the best thing that you can do for the war on drugs. And he's got books and he speaks in such an incredible way about how he talks about this one experience where he'd worked for over a year. All his seniors said that it was going to be the best thing they'd done. He'd worked from, criminalising street users, because that's how you work your way up to kind of get to the top boss. So he had 90 names of people and they chose this day. He'd risked his life to speak to people to get all these names. They'd criminalised everyone. It's a major operation, loads of money into it. And their analysis was, that went really well. We disrupted the drug trade for 2 hours. And I just think that screams to the hypocrisy of, people doing these massive drug raids and splashing it out in the paper that we've got this, we've seized this and we've done this drug raid. So I think there's probably lots of people that realise that it's not having the impact that it needs to.
It almost feels like that there are some people who are, not deliberately sabotaging it, but they kind of prefer the idea to show people they're doing something rather than looking at the actual issue. So, of course, that operation clearly failed if you disrupt the organised crime of drugs for 2 hours. But in the newspapers, the government's really doing something. And I feel like some people might be, you can correct me wrong, you've had more conversations, that people are just happy with that. It doesn't fix the issue, but it looks like they're doing something.
Absolutely. And I think that's what we see. We see, as the policing of drugs has changed, obviously the organised crime and the violence and the way that street users are used has developed, the way they've exploited children. That's only in the last, decade or so that more and more children are getting exploited because it's the way that kind of the violence towards the war on drugs has developed. And I was questioning the Met Commissioner recently about their approach to drugs and stop and search. And he was talking about county lines and how that's like one of the most important, when young people are being exploited either within a city or across between cities. He was saying that's where we're focusing all our time. And the National Police Chiefs Council, so NPCC, have some data showing that between cities, county lines have gone down by 12%. I don't think that's enough, but, that's progress. Within cities, it's gone up by 232%. So it's like, yes, you're going after county lines, but it doesn't seem to be impacting the volume of them. So it's, like you're saying, and also there's a policing principle that you're not meant to just measure success on police activity. It's meant to be on outcomes. So this is a measure of activity, arrests and that activity in that space, rather than drug deaths, exploitation of children, harmful supply, cost of the enforcement. Yeah, I feel like within policing, even if it's not drugs, anything else, they really do like to look at the activity rather than the outcomes. Because activity for a lot of people and a lot of politicians, that's doing something, but it's not necessarily the case. And I was in a meeting recently where a police officer was saying that they were giving some data on the people that they'd arrested through the ADA operation. And they said, I can't remember the percentage completely, but it was a high percentage, maybe 60 or 70 people that they arrest have been arrested before, and they were like shocked about this. And I was like, surely that shows that it's not working. If there's any measure of if something's a deterrent, the fact that 60 people have done it before.
The incarceration system in the US, the rate of return is high. That's not a good thing, is it? It shows it's a failed policy. So you went to Warsaw and you met with Femke Halsema. She's the mayor of Amsterdam. Yeah. You went over at the end of last year and took part in a drug conference. Can you walk me through that? And is there anything that you learned from being there?
Yeah, that was incredibly exciting. So there's a network of people working on harm reduction. So harm reduction came out of the HIV crisis and wanting to have needle exchanges, and obviously that really dovetails with drug use. So there's a big network across Europe that have been working on this, driven by health professionals and campaigners and people working in those kind of support services. So I asked the Mayor of London a question about drugs back in July, and the Mayor of Amsterdam's team picked up on it and invited me to come to this conference. So it's the second part. So last year, the Mayor of Amsterdam held a Dealing with Drugs conference, and it was incredible to see a politician of that level talking about drug regulation and just talking so boldly about the way that the drug trade and drug use was impacting the city, but in a very compassionate and public health driven way. So mainly talking about cocaine. And then this was part two in a kind of European setting. And it was absolutely incredible to take part of that, kind of representing London and being part of those discussions. So you had someone from Glasgow talking about the drug consumption room they've opened there, people from Amsterdam talking about their approach. And I was part of a whole discussion where we really spoke about what regulated cocaine would look like. And we split into 4 groups. And you had people looking at production and trade, and how you'd source cocaine. You had people looking at what the products would look like. The group I joined was around how people would buy it, like the shop front kind of element and what support. And then some of the restrictions, so how old and where and what. And just having those conversations about how this works in practice just moves it into a really different space. So Amsterdam are doing some brilliant stuff. And there was an absence where the Mayor of London, it would have been amazing to have the Mayor of London there, who I know cares about drugs. He set up his drug commission, which we're eagerly waiting the results of because it's 4 years after his announcement of it. And we still haven't seen the outcome of that, and it hasn't changed people's lives. He set up the London Drugs Forum, but it's just, I would love to hear him talking more transformation.
How receptive is he to this then? Because obviously he's started these commissions. It sounds like he's waxed lyrical about these ideas, but you're saying he's taken a slow approach.
Yeah.
So is this more about messaging for him and to signal to people that he does care, but actually when it comes to policy, when it comes to doing the work?
I mean, that's how it feels. The fact that he announced this drug commission back in 2021 was really exciting. It was in his manifesto. It quickly moved to just being about cannabis and mostly focused on the disproportionate policing of the black young people, which is, black community, which is incredibly important. We've got young black people being shackled with life-limiting, criminal records for small amounts of cannabis and things like that. So absolutely a priority. But I want to see him addressing that, and I want to see the outcomes of that. He said in July, he told me it was the end of the year. At the beginning of the year, he said it would be at the beginning of the year. So I'm really, it's already February. I'm really hoping that comes out soon. But I want to see him talking about the drug harms as well. And that is what the London Drug Forum are doing. They are doing some good stuff around making sure people get into treatment when they're released from prison, and improving that uptake, which is really important too. But yeah, I'd love to see him, like he has done with other things, like, him talking about the importance of tackling air pollution and taking a public health approach and listening to people with proper experience and, that loss. And like we were talking about at the top around anyone's child. So I asked him if he'd meet with anyone's child, and he said that his deputy mayor and lead for health could. So I'm trying to, I've got that date in the diary for them to meet with anyone's child. So yeah, I think he does care about it, but him showing that leadership like the Mayor of Amsterdam would be transformational.
You mentioned weed, and I do want to talk about weeds. Now, this isn't a new conversation. We've been having this conversation for years, and those that support its legalisation, and I brought up the comparison myself, to be fair, which is the comparison with alcohol. They say it's way more dangerous and harmful. Obviously, alcohol can make people violent. Think of fights on nights out and stuff, and obviously extremely highly addictive in its nature. So, alcoholism is an epidemic. But at the same time, I do often hear from many people that weed is relatively safe, certainly comparatively to alcohol. Do you think there's a worry, though, that there are some people are slightly glossing over weed as well because, it still has harmful effects, not to mention psychologically, and whilst decriminalisation or legalisation, I think, is a good idea, is a logical policy, do you think that some advocates are playing down those risks?
So there is a lot of noise around cannabis. I think the studies around psychological impacts are really important. And if you legalised and regulated it, you'd be looking at all this evidence and having that discussion, is what I'm hopeful comes out of the Mayor's Drug Commission, which is primarily looking at cannabis. I think that anything needs to have regulation and advice around it. And anything, around cannabis, often the discussion around the psychological impacts, which are really important to talk about, are kind of conflated with an age restriction as well. Like, as I said, around regulating, I want there to be restrictions around age. I'm not advocating for anyone to be able to use drugs. I think it needs to be looked at around the impacts that has on people's brains and development. And I think that's well documented. But I think often people, assume, well, the thing I find funny in the cannabis regulation discussion is everyone's like, if you allow people to grow at home, everyone will be growing cannabis. And you're like, no, people can make alcohol at home. Not many people do that. And also growing plants is, you have to have some kind of skill to do that. So I often think that's confused, that people think that regulating cannabis will result in everyone growing it. But I think the people who want to regulate it are just promoting the kind of hypocrisy with other drugs, and also, it's a plant. I think, like I said as well, we've got other countries who are taking this approach, and the UK is looking further and further behind. I think the harms are important to discuss, and I think in a conversation around legalisation and regulation, you can have that discussion in a way that I think even this question just shows how kind of polarised people's positions have become, and we're not having that proper debate and discussion that's sensible.
Portugal radically changed their policy on drugs. Now, drug-related deaths have remained below the EU average since 2001. Prisoners sentenced for drugs have fallen from 40 to 15%. Rates of drug use have remained consistently below the EU average, and they did that by mass decriminalisation. Now, for a while, it was definitely working, but now it seems like they're having problems. Global drug traffickers have apparently persistently used Portugal as a gateway to Europe's drug market. They target the country's coastal entry points, so there's a steady flow of drugs. Locals have been complaining about the visible drug use. There's been a spike in drug use, which the police say it's fueling the rise in violent crime. I do have a quote here. These days in Portugal, it is forbidden to smoke tobacco outside a school or a hospital. It is forbidden to advertise ice cream and sugar candies, and yet it is allowed for people to be there injecting drugs, said Rui Moreira, Porto's mayor. We've essentially normalised it. So what's happened? I do think, the policy I'm in support of, but I do think there's a slight bit of nuance going on, and there are some doubts around Portugal, when just a few years ago it was hailed as a success story. Can you give me something on that, and what's your analysis there? And also maybe there's some myths going around as well.
Yeah, and probably something I should have said earlier is I know there's often some confusion between what decriminalisation means and what legalisation and regulation means. So to decriminalise means that you are just not criminalising people that use it. So you're not actively pursuing arrests around people who use. And in Portugal, it is a small amount. So if people are carrying a larger amount, there will be criminalisation, but they've decriminalised that kind of personal use. In a legalised, regulated model, people access it. So you're not just legalising the use, you will create legal trade. It's a global market, and this is where we do need to come together on a global level to, that's why the UN commissioner saying that this needs to be looked at is really important. And you've got countries in the global south who are saying that we need to talk about this because of the impact on our countries. And this is why taking that global responsibility is really important. And like you've described, the way that Portugal is having that impact on the rest of Europe. And that's why in a legally regulated model, we've talked a lot about how people access it on an individual level, but you would also be creating legalised routes for people to do the trade and supply of all of the drugs. And that is massive. I'm not pretending that's an easy task. Yeah. So I think that's one really important thing to show around the Portugal model. It's amazing what they did. They were starting from a different place to the UK as well. So when they started, they didn't have a massive treatment approach. So obviously those gains investing in treatment and not criminalising people were huge at the beginning. But I do think it's really interesting that if it was legally regulated, you would be restricting advertising, you would be looking at what the labels look like. There's some great examples of what legalised drugs would look like on the Transforms website, which are like plain packaged, health advice, links to more advice, those quantities, which in a decriminalised approach, you wouldn't get that. Obviously, I think decriminalisation is better than criminalising people, but you absolutely quickly need to move that to that legal regulation, which I think is what Portugal shows. And I hope that's the progression they make rather than progressing back to criminalising.
I mean, that kind of perfectly goes on to my next question, but I feel like you kind of already answered it, which is that decriminalisation is a half solution because obviously I think it's better than charging people and sometimes imprisoning people, which is a health issue. It's not criminal, but it doesn't stop the drug dealers. It doesn't holistically change the nature of drugs in society. So in your view, is the ultimate goal to legalise all drugs or is it just some? Because from my point of view, there's no perfect drug policy.
I think ours is pretty good.
And I think drugs will always be an issue for a very long time. What are your thoughts on that? Do you think that all drugs should be legalised or certain drugs?
All of them. Yeah, absolutely all of them. And our policy is split into, so we worked on this policy back in 2019. It was a small group of Green Party members who wanted to progress our policy, which was only focused on cannabis. So we got together and we spoke to Anyone's Child, Transform, lots of health professionals around what the approach should be. And it's split into that short term. This is what we should be doing now, which is investing in all those great harm reduction things like drug consumption rooms and better education and things like that. And then long term, it goes through the principles, and we'd have an advisory group that would look at trends and would keep an eye on how use and trade in anything that would happen in a kind of illegal space. And then we go through each drug and say how they would be accessed in that sales venues, licensed sales, pharmacy, or a health, like a prescription.
So my final question, but I think it's actually quite a big one, so I'll save the best one to last. Can we only truly tackle this if we tackle class? And is drug use and addiction a feature of capitalism?
That is an amazing question, and that is huge. Absolutely, it's related to class, and that is at the centre of a lot of the campaigning groups are talking about how disproportionately, and I know you spoke earlier about America, but just the disproportionate sentencing, like Released, the organisation, do some incredible work on kind of calling out the racial and class injustices of who uses drugs, who gets stops and search, who gets criminalised. There's also a dynamic with where people use drugs and what drugs get spoken about, and what drugs are being legalised. We need to be talking about heroin and heroin street use. That's where the majority of people are dying from use of opioids, and I think that's where we need to be having a conversation. I definitely think class is a central point of this, and the general injustice. Another dynamic to bring in, which I wanted to mention, is the climate crisis element of this, which often gets not spoken about. And there's a group of people trying to advocate for a discussion around drugs at COP, because you can't save South American rainforests if people don't have control of how drugs are being produced. And there's loads of other ways that the climate crisis interacts with drugs and the drug supply and drug trade and drug use. So I do think this is what I often say about drug policy. Lots of people I've come across have said that it's not an important policy for them. They see many other policies more important. I see drug policy as rooted behind almost everything that people talk about around, capitalism and money, around the climate crisis, around health. If you care about tackling violence, you should care about legalising and regulating drugs. If you want to protect children, like the only way we're going to stop children getting exploited by a drug trade is to take it out of the hands of criminals. So I think people often see drug policy as being over here and something we should legally regulate and deal with as a use issue, but it's much more than that and sits behind all of these things.
Zoe, thank you so much for coming on to the left. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.